After I became a millionaire, I discovered the truth behind my family's fortune. My name is Catherine Sterling. I'm the founder and CEO of Sterling & Daughters, a luxury textile company that outfitted some of the most prestigious hotels along the eastern seaboard. But before all of that, before the penthouse in Boston's Back Bay, before the board meetings and the magazine covers, I was just a girl who thought she knew where she came from. The moment I'm about to tell you about happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was standing in my walk-in closet, running my fingers across a row of cashmere coats, when I felt it. That silk scarf tucked in the back corner. Cream-colored, with hand-embroidered edges in a pattern I'd seen 1,000 times, but never truly understood. My grandmother's scarf, the one she wore in every photograph from before I was born. I pulled it out, and as the morning light caught the golden threads woven through the fabric, something shifted in my chest. A memory, a question I'd never thought to ask. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Like this video so this story reaches more hearts, and subscribe for the next journeys. The scarf smelled faintly of lavender and something else. Something older, like aged wood and distant rain. I held it to my face and closed my eyes, and suddenly, I was 7 years old again, sitting on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom in our old house in Charleston, watching her fold linens with the kind of precision that seemed almost sacred. "Why do you always fold them that way, Grandma?" "Because, sweet girl, some things are meant to be remembered exactly as they were." At the time, I thought she meant the towels. Now, standing in a closet worth more than that entire Charleston house, I wasn't so sure. The truth is, I built my company on a foundation I thought I understood. My grandmother had been a seamstress. My mother expanded into small textile manufacturing. I took it global. 3 generations of women, each one building on the last. That's the story I told investors, journalists, myself. But that morning, with that scarf in my hands, I realized there were seams in our family history I'd never examined. Pockets I'd never turned inside out, and one of them had my grandmother's name stitched into the lining. The question that formed in my mind was so simple, so obvious. I couldn't believe I'd never asked it before. Where did she get the money to start? I stood there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. Outside my window, the Charles River moved slow and gray beneath a sky threatening rain. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't read. My assistant knocked twice and left when I didn't answer, because I was holding something that suddenly felt less like an heirloom and more like evidence. Evidence of what? I didn't yet know, but I would. The rest of that day moved like a dream I couldn't quite wake from. I went through the motions. Conference call at 10, lunch meeting with our design team at noon, fabric samples spread across my desk like a garden of expensive petals. I nodded at the right moments, approved the navy silk blend for the Chicago project, signed off on the new marketing campaign. But my mind kept drifting back to that scarf, now draped carefully across the chair in my office where I could see it. My office occupied the entire top floor of a converted textile mill in the Seaport district. Floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed brick, white oak floors that glowed honey gold in the afternoon sun. I'd designed it myself, every detail a testament to the aesthetic my grandmother had taught me. Quality over flash, substance over trend, beauty that whispers rather than shouts. On the credenza behind my desk sat a photograph in a silver frame. My grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, standing in front of her first shop in Charleston, 1967. She couldn't have been more than 30 in that picture. Wearing a simple dress she'd probably made herself, her dark hair pulled back, her expression serious. Proud. I picked up the frame and studied it more closely than I had in years. Behind her, just visible through the shop window, were bolts of fabric. Expensive fabric. Silk. Imported linen. Materials that, even then, would have cost a small fortune. How? I whispered to the empty office. My grandmother had arrived in Charleston in 1965, according to family legend, with nothing but a suitcase and a Singer sewing machine. 2 years later, she had a storefront in one of the better parts of town. The math had never added up, but I'd never questioned it. Success stories aren't supposed to be interrogated. They're supposed to inspire. That evening, I drove to my mother's house in Brookline instead of going home. She was in her garden when I arrived, trimming back the roses even though the season for it had passed. My mother, Julia, had her own relationship with perfection. Everything had to be controlled, managed, kept in its proper place. "Catherine." She looked up, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you. I found Grandma's scarf today, the cream one with the gold embroidery." Something flickered across her face. Brief, almost invisible. "That's lovely, darling." "Where did she get it?" "I don't know. She had it as long as I can remember." My mother returned to her roses, snipping with more force than necessary. "Why?" "I've been thinking about the business, about how she started. She was talented, determined. You know this story. I know the story we tell." I stepped closer, but I don't know the real one. My mother's hands stilled on the shears. For a moment, she looked exactly like the photograph of my grandmother. Same serious expression, same weight of something unspoken. "What brought this on?" "Just curiosity." She set down the shears and faced me fully. "Your grandmother built something from nothing. That's all that matters." "But how did she—" "Catherine." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Some questions don't need answers." I drove home through streets slick with rain that had finally begun to fall, my mother's words echoing in my head. Some questions don't need answers. But I'd built a multi-million-dollar company by asking questions everyone else ignored. By looking at fabrics no one else saw potential in, at markets no one else believed in, at problems no one else wanted to solve. And now I had a question that felt bigger than all of them. That night, in my penthouse with the city lights blurred by rain, I pulled out every photograph I had of my grandmother, spread them across my dining table like pieces of a puzzle I'd never known was incomplete. In every single one, she wore something beautiful, something expensive, something that didn't match the story of a woman who'd started with nothing. The next morning, I canceled my meetings. I told my assistant I was working from home, which was technically true. I just didn't mention that the work had nothing to do with Sterling and Daughters. Instead, I sat at my dining table surrounded by photographs, old letters, and a growing sense that the foundation I'd built my entire life on might be made of something other than what I'd believed. There's a particular kind of vertigo that comes from questioning your own origin story. Every achievement suddenly feels uncertain. Every proud moment, standing on stage, accepting industry awards, cutting the ribbon on our flagship store in Manhattan, seeing my face on the cover of Forbes, all of it became wrapped in a new question. What was I really building on? I made coffee. I didn't drink, and watched the morning light move across the photographs. My grandmother's face looked back at me from a dozen different moments. Always composed, always elegant, always wearing that expression that I'd inherited. The one people mistook for confidence, but was really just careful control. I picked up my phone 3 times to call my mother, put it down 3 times. Because part of me didn't want to know. Part of me wanted to slide everything back into its boxes, return the scarf to the closet, continue building the legacy I thought I understood. Ignorance, I was learning, had a certain comfort to it, a certain safety. But I'd never been good at safe. By noon, I was in my car, driving south toward Charleston. 600 miles of highway stretching between my present and my past. Between the woman I'd become and the girl I'd been. The woman who thought she knew everything, and the girl who'd never thought to ask. I arrived at dusk, when the city turned golden and soft. when the old houses seemed to glow from within. I'd booked a room at a boutique hotel downtown, but I didn't check in. Instead, I drove to the address I'd memorized from the photograph, the location of my grandmother's first shop. It was a wine bar now, exposed brick, Edison bulbs, couples leaning close over small tables. Through the window, I could see exactly where her cutting table would have been, where she would have stood pinning hems and taking measurements and building something that would eventually become mine. "Can I help you?" I turned. A woman in her 70s stood on the sidewalk beside me, walking a small white dog. "I'm sorry, my grandmother used to have a shop here, a long time ago." "Oh? What was her name?" "Eleanor Sterling." The woman's face changed. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed. A small shift, like a door closing. "I don't remember that name." But she did. I could tell she did. "Are you sure?" It would have been in the late 60s, early 70s. This area has changed a lot since then. She tugged gently on the dog's leash. "Have a nice evening." She walked away before I could ask anything else, and I stood there watching her go, feeling like I'd just been given another piece of a puzzle I didn't know how to assemble. That night in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my mother's words. Some questions don't need answers. About the way that woman's face had changed when I mentioned my grandmother's name. About the scarf, the photographs, the expensive fabrics that appeared in a shop that shouldn't have been able to afford them. At 2 a.m, I finally admitted what I'd been avoiding since I found that scarf. I was afraid of what the truth might be. Because here's what no one tells you about success. The higher you build, the more you have to lose. And I'd built very high. My name was on buildings, contracts, products sold in 32 countries. I employed 473 people. I'd given speeches about legacy, about building on the shoulders of strong women, about honoring the past while creating the future. But what if the past I was honoring was a fiction? What if everything I'd built was standing on a foundation made of secrets? I got out of bed and stood at the window, looking out at Charleston's sleeping streets. Somewhere out there was the truth about my grandmother, about where the money came from, about why my mother didn't want me to ask. And despite the fear, despite the vertigo, despite everything I might lose, I knew I wouldn't stop looking until I found it. I spent the next 3 days in Charleston like a detective in my own family history. The public library had newspapers on microfilm dating back to the 1960s. I sat in a basement room that smelled like old paper and dust, scrolling through pages until my eyes burned, looking for any mention of Eleanor Sterling, any advertisement for her shop, any trace of the woman I thought I knew. I found her finally on a Thursday afternoon, but not in the way I expected. It was a society page from 1966, one of those features about Charleston's social scene, filled with photographs of garden parties and charity luncheons. And there, in the bottom corner, a small image. My grandmother standing next to a man I didn't recognize at some kind of gala. The caption read, "Eleanor Beaumont and Mr. Richard Covington at the Historical Society Spring Benefit." Eleanor Beaumont, not Sterling. My hands shook as I printed the page. Beaumont had been her maiden name. I knew that. She'd married my grandfather, Thomas Sterling, in 1968. But seeing it in print, attached to a photograph where she wore a gown that must have cost more than most people made in a year, standing next to a man whose name I'd never heard, in a social circle she'd never mentioned. Everything tilted. I took the printout back to my hotel and sat on the bed, staring at it until the light outside faded. Then I did what I should have done from the beginning. I called my mother. "Catherine, it's nearly 9 o'clock. Who is Richard Covington?" Silence. Long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. "Where did you hear that name?" "In a newspaper from 1966. He's in a photograph with Grandma, at a gala, before she married Grandpa, before she supposedly arrived in Charleston with nothing. Catherine. Who was he, Mom? More silence. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. You should come home. I need to know now. Not over the phone. Why not? Because... Her voice cracked, and I realized with a shock that my mother was crying. My mother, who never cried, who controlled everything including her emotions. Because this isn't just about your grandmother, it's about all of us. I was on the road within an hour, driving north through darkness, my mind racing faster than the car. Eleanor Beaumont, Richard Covington, a life before the life I knew about. Money that appeared from somewhere I'd never questioned. I reached my mother's house just after 2 a.m. She was waiting in the living room, still dressed, a leather box on the coffee table in front of her. I promised her I would never tell you, she said, before I even sat down. I promised her this would stay buried. But you're going to tell me anyway. Because you won't stop looking. And because... She touched the box lightly. Because maybe she was wrong. Maybe some secrets do more damage kept than shared. She opened the box. Inside were letters, documents, photographs I'd never seen. My grandmother, younger than in any picture I knew, wearing clothes that whispered of old money, standing in front of houses that spoke of generations of wealth. Your grandmother wasn't from nothing, my mother said. She was from everything. I picked up one of the photographs. A plantation house, white columns, sprawling grounds. The Beaumont family owned half of South Carolina at one point. Textile mills, mostly. Your grandmother grew up with more money than we'll ever have. Then why? Richard Covington was her fiancé. Their families had arranged it when she was 16. He was 43. The words hit me like a physical blow. My mother continued, her voice steady now, as if telling this story was a relief after decades of holding it in. She didn't want to marry him. She didn't want any of it. The society life, the expectations, the future that had been planned for her since birth. So she did something unthinkable for a Beaumont woman in 1965. She ran. She walked away from everything. The money, the name, the house, all of it. She changed her last name legally, moved to Charleston where no one knew her, and tried to start over. I looked down at the photographs, at the grand house, at the life my grandmother had abandoned. But she couldn't start with nothing, I said slowly. Not really. My mother's face held an expression I'd never seen before. Part shame, part defiance, part something that looked almost like pride. Before she left, she took something. Something that was technically hers by inheritance, but that her family would never have let her have if they'd known she was leaving. She reached into the box and pulled out a smaller envelope. Inside was a necklace, diamonds and sapphires in a setting so intricate it could only have been made by a master craftsman. She sold it, piece by piece, over 2 years. That's how she bought the shop. That's how she afforded the fabric, the location, everything. I held the photographs and felt my entire history rewriting itself in my hands. So, the business, everything I built, it's all from stolen money? No. My mother's voice was fierce now. It's from money that was hers, from a woman who chose freedom over fortune and then built a new fortune on her own terms. That's your legacy, Catherine. Not theft. Choice. But I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Everything I'd believed was a lie. And everything I'd built suddenly felt like it was built on sand. I didn't go home that night. I sat in my mother's living room until dawn, going through the contents of that leather box piece by piece. Letters my grandmother had written but never sent, addressed to her own mother. Photographs of a life that looked beautiful from the outside, but read like a prison sentence in her careful handwriting. Documents showing the legal name change, the sale of jewelry through discreet dealers in Atlanta and Charlotte, the lease agreement for that first shop, and underneath everything, a journal. My mother made coffee as the sun rose. We didn't speak. She simply set a cup beside me and sat in the chair across from mine, waiting. I opened the journal to a random page. My grandmother's handwriting, the same elegant script I'd seen on birthday cards and recipe cards and business ledgers, filled every line. They keep telling me I should be grateful. Grateful for the house, the clothes, the life they've given me. Grateful that a man like Richard would want to marry a girl like me. As if I'm the one receiving the gift. As if my whole existence is meant to be an expression of gratitude for being allowed to exist in their world. I turned another page. I look at the women in my mother's social circle, and I see ghosts. Beautiful, expensively dressed ghosts who stopped being real people somewhere along the way. They exist to decorate, to host, to produce the right children at the right intervals. I would rather have nothing than become that. Another page. I took the necklace last night. Grandmother Beaumont's sapphire necklace, the one she left to me in her will. I remember her wearing it once, at a Christmas party, and she pulled me aside and said, "This will be yours someday, Eleanor. Use it wisely." I don't think she meant sell it to buy freedom, but I think she would have understood. She never regretted it, my mother said softly, in case you're wondering. She never once looked back and wished she'd stayed. I closed the journal and looked at her, really looked at her. My mother, who had grown up knowing this story, who had carried this secret her entire life, who had built her own version of the business knowing exactly where it came from. Why didn't you tell me? Because she asked me not to, and because... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because I thought if you knew the beginning was complicated, you might question everything that came after. Your confidence, your pride in the business, your sense of who you are. You thought I was too fragile to handle the truth. I thought the truth was hers to carry, not yours. But it was mine now, whether I wanted it or not. I spent the next week in a kind of emotional suspension. I went back to Boston, back to my office, back to the meetings and decisions and daily architecture of running a company. But everything felt different. The photographs on my wall, the fabrics we chose, the very name Sterling and Daughters, all of it had new weight, new meaning. I found myself staring at that photograph of my grandmother in front of her first shop, seeing it completely differently now. Not a woman who had built something from nothing, but a woman who had chosen to build something from scratch even though she didn't have to, who had walked away from guaranteed wealth to create uncertain freedom, which was, I was beginning to realize, so much harder. One evening, I stood in my closet holding that cream-colored scarf again. I'd had it analyzed by a textile expert, just to satisfy my own curiosity. Hand-embroidered silk from Italy, probably late 1950s, worth several $1,000s even now. My grandmother had kept it, even when she was selling everything else. A reminder, maybe, of what she'd left behind. Or proof that she'd been there at all. I wrapped it around my neck and looked at myself in the mirror. I had her eyes, her way of standing. Her belief that beautiful things matter, that quality is never an accident, that how we make things says something about who we are. But I also had something she'd given me without meaning to. The understanding that legacy isn't just what you inherit. It's what you choose to do with what you've been given. She'd been given wealth and status and a predetermined future. She chose to walk away and build something else. I'd been given a company and a story and a version of history that made everything simple. Now I had to choose what to do with the complicated truth. I pulled out my phone and called my mother. "I need to know everything," I said when she answered. "Not just the headlines, everything. The family she left behind. What happened to them. Whether anyone ever tried to find her. All of it. Catherine. I can't run a company built on her choices if I don't understand what those choices cost her. My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then, come to dinner on Sunday, I'll tell you the rest. I hung up and looked at myself in the mirror again. Same face, same closet, same life. But I was beginning to see it all differently. And I was beginning to understand that the truth, however complicated, was the only foundation worth building on. Sunday dinner became a ritual. Every week for the next month, I drove to my mother's house in Brookline, and she pulled out another piece of my grandmother's hidden history. More letters, more photographs. Stories she'd been told in pieces over the years, assembled now into something approaching a complete picture. The Beaumont family had been furious when Eleanor disappeared. They'd hired investigators, threatened legal action, tried everything to force her to return. But she'd been strategic about her escape. She'd waited until she was 21, legally able to make her own decisions, and she'd covered her tracks carefully. Changed her name, moved to a city where the Beaumont influence was strong but not absolute. Started fresh in an industry they would have considered beneath them. They thought she'd come crawling back, my mother said one evening, pouring wine into crystal glasses my grandmother had chosen. They thought once the money ran out, once reality set in, she'd realize what she'd given up. But she didn't. No. She married your grandfather, a kind man who worked in maritime insurance, who had no family money and didn't care about hers. She built her business slowly, carefully, on her own terms, and she never contacted them again. Did they try to find her after she got successful? My mother's expression shifted. That's the interesting part. She pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1981. An obituary. Richard Covington, the man my grandmother had been engaged to, had died of a heart attack at 58. The obituary mentioned his wife, his children, his business accomplishments. It also mentioned, in the final paragraph, that he'd made a substantial donation to the Charleston Historical Society in memory of Eleanor Beaumont, whose grace and spirit enriched our community. He never stopped thinking about her, I said quietly. I don't know if it was love or obsession or just the fact that she was the one thing he couldn't have. But yes, he never forgot her. I studied the clipping, this glimpse of a parallel life my grandmother had avoided. A life where she would have been Mrs. Richard Covington, hosting benefits and sitting on boards and slowly disappearing into the role that had been written for her. Instead, she'd been Eleanor Sterling, shop owner, mother, builder of a legacy that would eventually become mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about choices and consequences, about the life my grandmother had refused and the life she'd created instead. About the fact that I existed because she'd been brave enough to walk away from everything safe and certain. I got up and went to my office, even though it was past midnight. I stood at the windows overlooking the harbor, watching the lights of boats moving in the darkness, and I thought about what my mother had said weeks ago. Some questions don't need answers. But she'd been wrong. Some questions don't need answers if you're content to live on the surface of your own life. If you're willing to accept the stories you've been told without examining them too closely. If you're okay building on a foundation you don't fully understand. But I'd never been that person. And my grandmother hadn't been either. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I'd been drafting something for weeks. An idea that had been forming since that first morning with the scarf, that had been growing with every revelation, every piece of truth my mother shared. A new direction for Sterling and Daughters. I'd been thinking about expansion, new markets, new products, the same growth strategy I'd always pursued. But now I was thinking about something different, something that honored not just my grandmother's business sense, but her courage. her willingness to risk everything for authenticity. I started typing. The Eleanor Initiative, a foundation supporting women leaving difficult circumstances to start their own businesses. Not charity, investment, not rescue, partnership. Providing the resources to women who are brave enough to choose uncertainty over unhappiness, freedom over security, their own path over someone else's plan. I worked through the night, building the framework, sketching the structure, outlining how it would work alongside Sterling and Daughters without compromising either. By the time the sun rose over Boston Harbor, I had something real, something that felt true. The next morning, I called an emergency board meeting. My CFO thought I was insane. My investors were skeptical. But I presented the Eleanor Initiative with the same clarity and conviction I'd used to build every other part of the company. This isn't just good marketing, I told them. This is who we are. This is where we came from. And this is how we honor that. The vote was unanimous. 2 weeks later, I stood in my mother's living room with the leather box that had started everything. I'm going to tell the story, I said. Not all of it, not the private parts, but the part about a woman who chose freedom and built something real. I'm going to make it part of the company's public history. My mother nodded slowly. She would have liked that. Near the end, she told me she wished she'd been more honest about where she came from. She thought maybe her silence had done more harm than good. What do you mean? She thought if other women knew the truth, that she'd come from privilege and still had to fight for her freedom, that money doesn't protect you from being trapped, that leaving is hard no matter who you are, maybe it would help them. Maybe they wouldn't feel so alone. I looked down at the box, at the photographs and letters and evidence of a life more complicated than any story I could have imagined. There's one more thing, my mother said. Something I need to show you before you go public with any of this. She reached into the back of her closet and pulled out a garment bag I'd never seen before. Inside was a dress, cream silk with gold embroidery that matched the scarf exactly. Beautifully made, clearly expensive, and clearly handmade by someone who understood fabric the way most people understand breathing. She made this the week before she left, her last project in the Beaumont house. She told me once that every stitch was an act of rebellion, that she was using their fabric, their tools, their training, everything they'd given her to turn her into the perfect society wife, to create something that was entirely hers. And then she wore it the day she walked out. I touched the fabric, feeling the weight of it, the precision of every seam. And I finally understood what I'd been looking for all along. Not just the truth about where the money came from, but the truth about who my grandmother really was, and who I could choose to be because of her. The launch of the Eleanor Initiative happened on an October morning, exactly 1 year after I found that scarf in my closet. We held the event at our flagship store in Boston, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that let in light the way my grandmother always said a workspace should. I'd invited journalists, investors, employees, and 20 women who would be our first recipients. Women leaving corporate jobs that demanded too much, marriages that gave too little, families that refused to see them, futures that had been written without their consent. Women who were choosing the uncertain over the unbearable. I stood at the podium with that cream-colored scarf around my neck and the photograph of my grandmother behind me. Not the one from in front of her shop, but a new one. One my mother had given me from the leather box. My grandmother at 20, standing in a garden at the Beaumont estate, looking directly at the camera with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. An expression that said, I know exactly who I'm supposed to be, and I'm choosing something else. My grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, built this company from nothing, I began. That's the story I've told for years. That's the story I believed. I paused, looking out at the faces watching me. But it wasn't true. Not entirely. I told them about Eleanor Beaumont, About the plantation house and the arranged marriage and the wealth she'd been born into. About the sapphire necklace she'd sold piece by piece to buy her freedom. About the choice she made to walk away from everything certain in order to build something real. She didn't start from nothing, I said. She started from the rubble of everything she'd destroyed to get free. And she built this company, this legacy, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Because she understood that real wealth isn't what you inherit. It's what you create when you're brave enough to become who you actually are. The room was silent. The Eleanor Initiative exists for women making that same choice. Women who are walking away from lives that look perfect on paper but feel like prisons in practice. We're not offering charity. We're offering partnership, investment, belief. The same things my grandmother would have needed if she'd had anyone to ask. After the presentation, a woman approached me. She was in her 40s, well-dressed, carrying herself with the kind of careful composure I recognized. "I'm leaving a law firm where I've worked for 18 years, she said quietly. "I'm walking away from partner track to start a nonprofit for women in legal crises. Everyone thinks I'm insane. Are you?" She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her. Probably, but I'd rather be insane and honest than sane and empty. I thought about my grandmother in that garden, looking at the camera with that not-quite smile. Then you're exactly where you need to be. That evening, I drove to my mother's house one more time. She was in her garden again, but this time she wasn't cutting anything back. She was planting. Bulbs for spring, she told me. Things that would sleep through winter and wake up when the time was right. "I watched the live stream," she said. "You did well." I told the truth, or most of it, the parts that matter. We stood together in the fading light, and I realized something I should have understood months ago. My mother hadn't been protecting just my grandmother's secret. She'd been protecting her own choice to keep it, her own relationship with a truth too complicated to summarize, her own understanding of what legacy means. "She would have been proud of you," my mother said finally. "Not just for the business. For this. For telling the truth. For understanding that some truths are meant to be shared, even when they're complicated, especially then." I went home to my penthouse as the city lights began to glow against the darkening sky. I made tea in the kitchen my grandmother would have loved. Clean lines, beautiful materials, everything chosen with intention. I wrapped myself in the cream-colored scarf and stood at the windows, watching Boston become a constellation of light and shadow. And I thought about the question that had started everything. Where did the money come from? The answer, I now knew, was more complicated than a simple transaction. The money came from jewelry my grandmother had inherited from a woman who'd told her to use it wisely. But before that, it came from textile mills built by men who believed wealth was measured in property and control. And before that, from land and labor and systems my grandmother had no part in creating but inherited nonetheless. She couldn't change where the money came from, but she could change what it became. She'd taken wealth built on one woman's silence and used it to create a business that celebrated women's voices. She'd taken an inheritance meant to keep her trapped and transformed it into freedom, not just for herself, but eventually for the 473 people who worked for Sterling and Daughters, and now for the women who would benefit from the Eleanor Initiative. That was the real truth I'd been looking for. Not where we came from, but what we chose to build with what we'd been given. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo my mother had sent me earlier, another picture from the leather box I hadn't seen before. My grandmother in her shop, probably mid-1970s, her hands on a bolt of fabric, looking down at it with complete focus. The kind of focus that comes from doing exactly what you're meant to do, regardless of what anyone expected. I saved it as my phone's background. Because after I became a millionaire, I discovered the truth behind my family's fortune. And the truth was this: Wealth means nothing if you can't choose what to do with it. Legacy means nothing if it's built on silence. And success means nothing if it doesn't honor the courage of the women who made it possible. My grandmother gave me more than a company. She gave me permission to question everything, to seek complicated truths, and to build something real even when the foundation is messy. That's the inheritance that matters. That's the one I'll pass on. If this story touched you, leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments and subscribe for the next journey.